This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Melinda Condon of the P&A Foundation. And again, I thank you for joining us today for this session on community engagement, creating a successful Spanish language section. This is the fifth in the P&A Foundation Special Diversity Series, Leading Local, the media's impact on diversity, inclusion, and equity. Many thanks to the Calkins Foundation for providing a grant that made this series possible. Our earlier sessions included Respect at Work, Amplifying Diverse Voices in Your Coverage, 10 Steps to More Inclusive Reporting, and Seeing the Whole Community. If you missed any of them, they were recorded, and we are happy to share the recordings. Simply contact me or Teresa. Today, we are delighted to have Bill Horner III and Victoria Johnson joining us from the Chatham News and Record, part of a weekly news organization serving rural Chatham County in North Carolina. Bill's the publisher and editor and a third-generation newspaper man, while Victoria is a reporter and the lead reporter for Voz de Chatham, which they will be discussing today. We look forward to learning from their insights and experiences and are especially excited to be discussing the Spanish language-focused product during National Hispanic Heritage Month. A few reminders, if you haven't already, please mute your audio. Please note that today's session is being recorded. The recording will be made available to you as well as to the folks that were unable to join us at this particular time. And if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat room. Bill and Victoria are interested in any comments or questions you may have. So with that, I thank you again for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Bill and Victoria and wish everyone a good session. Thank you.
Thank you, Melinda, and thank you all for being here. It's a real privilege for Victoria and me to talk about Voz, and particularly with folks from Pennsylvania. I've been involved in the North Carolina Press Association for 30-some years. I'm a past president, and we know the strength of the Pennsylvania group of newspapers. So it's a privilege for us to be asked and to have the opportunity to talk to you. And this is going to be really informal. Victoria and I are going to talk to you about our Voz de Chatham project and show you some slides, and we'll be happy to answer a lot of questions. But I want to start off by giving you just a little bit of background about the Chatham News and Record. So we are in rural Chatham County, North Carolina. Chatham County is right in the center of North Carolina. It has a population of about 70,000. But the largest town's population is only about 8,000, so it's extremely rural. We are just south of Chapel Hill, just west of the Raleigh Research Triangle Park Market, just east of Greensboro. So we're surrounded by really unique and larger markets, but we are very small and rural, but growing. Chatham County is actually one of the fastest growing counties in North Carolina, due in large part to Chatham Park, which is a planned community in Chatham County. So Pittsboro, North Carolina, which is the county seat, has a population of about 7,000 or 8,000. That population is expected to grow to 70,000 in the next 25 years with Chatham Park. So it's a really unique market. When I talk to people about the Chatham News and Record, one of the things I always say is that we're a 143-year-old startup. So I spent most of my career at the Sanford Herald in my hometown of Sanford, which is in just the adjoining county to Chatham County. My grandfather started that paper in 1930. I worked there starting when I was 13 years old, like a lot of family-owned newspaper folks. Worked in every department, graduated from the University of Kansas and came and started working full-time in 1985. We sold to Paxton Media Group in 1998, and I was named publisher and was publisher for 18 years, and I retired in 2016. Enjoyed a very happy 2.5-year retirement, and one of my best friends, Kurt Bradley, who is a developer, a commercial developer, and one of his friends, Chris Ehrenfeld, who's a residential developer, approached me about joining them and buying the Chatham News and Chatham Record newspapers. And we did that. We actually made the announcement, ironically, 3 years ago today, is when we announced that we were actually making the purchase, and the sale closed about a month later. So what we did is we bought the two newspapers, the Chatham News and the Chatham Record. It's really identical papers, The only difference in the papers was the cover. One newspaper served Siler City, which is the largest town in Chatham County, and was kind of the textile base, chicken processing base, a lot of industry in Siler City. And the other paper served Pittsburgh, which I mentioned. We just essentially combined the papers. The papers were 95% identical anyway. So when we combined the papers, we made it the Chatham News and Record. We bought the papers from the Resch family. The Resch family had owned the paper for about 9 decades. Alan Resch, who was a friend of mine from the Press Association, knew him very well. He was also a 3rd-generation publisher, and he passed away actually the week that I retired from Sanford. And so it was, again, 2.5 years later that we bought the paper. So we have been trying to reinvent the paper. The paper really had no website, very little local news content, no social media platforms, very little digital presence, not many local bylines. So our goal was to kind of reinvent the paper. So that's what we've done. The last 2 years in the North Carolina Press Association, we won more awards for our news coverage than any other community paper in the entire state, which is, we take a lot of satisfaction. We do really good work, and Victoria's a part of that work. So that's kind of a little bit of background about the News and Record. And Victoria, I don't know if you want to show a slide to show what the old paper used to look like before we acquired it. That's kind of a look there at the old Chatham News and Record. Very photo heavy. There was a photographer who did all the layouts. These papers are from right before we bought them. These are a few of the papers right before we bought the newspaper, and you can tell the design was kind of stuck in the 70s and 80s. And then Victoria, if you'll show kind of what we look like now. We did a full redesign of the newspaper and website and so forth, and feel like we've got a very good looking product, and we're very proud of it. And we're not just a newspaper. We're working on providing information and news to a lot of different platforms. So of course we've got LaVoe's, which we're talking about today. We have a podcast that we're developing called the Chatcast. We've got Chatham 411, which is our annual community almanac. Chatham Life, which is a magazine that we publish annually. In fact, the 2021-22 edition just actually was published this week. Chatham Brew, which is kind of our family of electronic newsletters, and there's also a Chatham Brew Coffee, which we've developed with a local roaster, which is another subject altogether. And then we're trying to do community projects like the 20 Under 40 project, which we're doing right now. So there's just a lot that we're doing for the Chatham News and Record. So here today to talk to you about LaVoe's, and I'm going to kind of run through a little bit about how LaVoe's was developed, and then have Victoria talk to you about some of the specifics. But we had an opportunity once COVID kind of got ramped up in March and April of 2020 to apply for a Facebook grant. Facebook had a COVID relief grant that they announced, and I don't know if any of you were familiar with those grants, but we applied. You could ask for up to $100,000, and they were really targeting. They wanted media properties to target a very specific COVID-related project. And I thought for us, at the time, we have the largest employer in Siler City is a poultry processing plant. And we have a very high percentage of Latinos in Chatham County. And I thought, what an opportunity to use some funds to do specialized coverage on COVID's impact on the Latino population. So we applied, and I thought in my wisdom, which turned out not to be wisdom, you could ask for up to $100,000. I thought if I had a really unusual dollar value, that it might attract attention instead of just asking for the full $100,000. So I kind of envisioned this as a 3 or 4 or 5 month project, and I asked for $30,600, and that's what I got, and which I'm very, very thankful for. But I found out later that of the 9 media organizations in North Carolina that were awarded grant funds, 7 of them asked for and got $100,000. I know Victoria would have been a lot happier had I asked for $100,000, but I got what I asked for, so that be a lesson to you. But of the 9 newspapers, of the 9, shouldn't say newspapers because there's not, but the 9 media organizations that were funded, there were only 2 legacy print newspapers that got funded. And just as an aside here, since we got money from that project, we've also become a part of the UNC Table Stakes program, which is from the Knight Lindfest Foundation, which some of you may be familiar with table stakes. We also were accepted into the Facebook Accelerator program. And again, our cohorts in those 2 programs, not many legacy print papers. A lot of them are digital only. Many of them are nonprofit. So you don't find a lot of for-profit legacy print organizations who are applying for these funds or being awarded these funds. And I'll just say, you need to keep your eye out for opportunities to get grant funding like this, because I'm not going to say it's free money, but it really gives us a lot of opportunities to kind of work on our audience development and work on our product development as well. So it's been fantastic. So we got grant funding for LaVose, and I'll tell you a quick story about how we got started, because I had a reporter who was actually from Chatham County. He was getting ready to graduate from UNC. The Hussman School of Journalism in Chapel Hill is literally 35, 40 minutes from where I park my car. I've got a lot of relationships at the J School there, and we had a young reporter who was getting ready to graduate, who was from Chatham County, and I had her all lined up once we got funding for this, once we were awarded the grant funding. I had her lined up to take the LaVose project. And a few days before she was supposed to start, she came to me and she got a better offer. Her plan was to go to law school after a year anyway, and she actually took a much higher paying job doing mattress reviews for an online mattress company. She hates the work, but it's good money, and now she's in law school, and it kind of helped fund her law school ambition, which is great. She actually did some stringing work in that year where she was writing about mattresses. But her law, with her not taking that position, it kind of put me in a tough spot. I had another reporter that I had lined up for an opening that we had, and I offered him the LaVose position. He accepted. He worked a half a day and then emailed me from home after we got him enrolled and onboarded and said, I don't think I want to do this. And his concerns were primarily COVID. He has older parents, and he knew that the work involved being out in the Hispanic community, and he did not want to risk himself or his parents. All along, I have been talking to Victoria, who, like these other 2 folks, is also a 2020 graduate of Carolina. And I had Victoria kind of slotted to be my part-time person because I got funding for a full-time person and a part-time person. It was a real stroke of luck for us that both the other 2 reporters did not take the position, because neither of them spoke English. One of them neither of them spoke Spanish. One of them could understand a little bit of Spanish. Victoria is not a native speaker, but she is fluent in Spanish because she studied the language. In fact, spent a year in Spain studying. And that turned out to be a real blessing for us, because one of the things we learned is that when you're trying to cover a population, and you all know this from your own newspapers, you have to have trust in your community. You have to have trust with your audience. You've got to be able to develop trust and credibility. And for an English language newspaper, which before we bought it, just did not write about the Hispanic community, did not write about the Black community in Chatham County. For us to want to write about them and not have anyone on the staff who spoke Spanish would have been a real hindrance. And the fact that Victoria knows the language and knows the culture really made LaVose work for us. So we brought Victoria on board. We hired another part-time person who was a native Spanish speaker who was also at the J School at Carolina, and launched LaVose. And we did it with some partnerships. We worked with a Hispanic liaison. You can see the slide here. El Vinculo Hispano in Siler City, the Hispanic liaison, has been working in Siler City for many, many years. We actually reached out to some of the folks in the community who had influence in the Latino community, and as we began to launch, and that was very, very critical for us to make the project work as we started doing those stories. So my task to Victoria was pretty simple. Let's go out and tell the stories that are not being told, not just COVID related, but stories about the Latinx, the Latino community that need to be told. And it was a little bit of a challenge, which I'll have Victoria talk to you about as she got started. But one of the things we ran into is that our regular old-time readers who were not used to reading about the Hispanic community, who had lived in the same community with a lot of this population, but really did not see them as an integral part of the community. When we started writing about them, that raised a lot of questions about our credibility among some of our readers. So that was a challenge that we had to overcome. So when we launched LaVoz, we figured out one of the things that we had as a challenge is how do we get the message across, because we're going to be writing these stories in English, printed in our English language newspaper about a population that largely does not speak English. So how are we going to make sure they know what we're doing? So strategically, and this was a part of our grant, we wanted to have translators. So Victoria does a lot of the translation work. Our part-timer also does that, and I'll have Victoria talk about that. But everything that Victoria writes in English that has the LaVoz logo, everything that we write that's related to LaVoz is published in our print edition. It shows up on our online edition in English, but we also have a LaVoz tab on our website that has all of that content in Spanish. So every week we'll have 1 or 2 or 3 stories that Victoria writes in English with the LaVoz tag to it, in addition to other critical reporting that we do in English. It is also translated into Spanish, and it's on our website. So you can go to chathamnewsrecord.com. It's all in front of our paywall. If you go to chathamnewsrecord.com, and we'll send you that link, you can just click on LaVoz and read all that content. You can read it in English or in Spanish. We also created a Facebook page, and Victoria will talk about that, but we created a Facebook page to post and share the content. So the links on Facebook go directly to the stories on the website. And again, those are in front of the paywall. So we also are working through some other social media platforms as well that Victoria will talk about. But really, it was a kind of a long, slow, uphill trip to be able to build trust and build audience for the content. And the kind of content that we did with LaVoz really touched on everything. There was obviously a lot of COVID coverage. A lot of the Latino population who works in Chatham County, they're not insured. So how, if they contract COVID, they want to get tested for COVID, how does all that work? Our COVID coverage has been, I think, exemplary in English and in Spanish for both sets of the population. But to be able to provide the critical information that people needed to know, as you all know, in the last year and a half with the pandemic, our work that we do in our business is so critical to getting accurate, timely, compelling, meaningful information out to the audience. And the fact that we were doing that in 2 languages, I think, was a real boost for the community and something that we felt good about doing. But it was more than just COVID coverage. We did business coverage. We did human interest. We did a lot of stories involving the faith community. And I just want to say particularly about Victoria's business coverage. We have a lot of Hispanic businesses, particularly in Siler City, that have really struggled. I don't know what's happened in your markets, but in our markets with COVID, a lot of the small retailers, particularly restaurants, really struggled. And Victoria's done an amazing job of telling those stories about restaurants that have closed and restaurants that have opened, and people who've branched out to be entrepreneurs in the time of a pandemic. I'm not going to talk anymore about the coverage because you can go online and see that. I'm going to turn it over to Victoria now and let her kind of walk through and talk about her experiences She has been the boots on the ground. And I just can't say enough about her good work and the relationships that she's built and the feedback that we've gotten and what it's meant to us. We wanted to use the grant to build our audience, obviously. We felt like the coverage that we needed to provide readers was critical without regard to any kind of commercial or profit gain. It's just something that we needed to do as the newspaper in the community. I pictured it again as a 3 or 4 or 5 month project. The funding from Facebook ran out, as you can imagine, a long time ago. We've since gotten the project funded by our local hospital and by Mountaire Farms, which is the poultry processing plant. It doesn't cover our costs. It doesn't cover the cost of keeping Victoria and our part-timer employed. But we feel like the coverage is so important that we've sustained the coverage and we've got such great feedback about it that we're going to keep it going as long as we can. So that's that. I'll turn it over to Victoria and let her share a little bit about her experience as the project has grown.
Right, thanks, Bill. So I'll start from the very beginning. I first joined the project in June of 2020, the end of June, in fact. And I have to say, when I first joined it, I was a little bit intimidated. Even growing up in North Carolina, I had never, ever been to Chatham County. I didn't know the area, much less the Spanish-speaking community. And I did speak Spanish, as Bill mentioned. I had studied it for 6 years, all through high school and into college. And my experience really culminated in my year abroad in Spain. But the thing about that is that Spain Spanish, like Castilian Spanish, is very different from Latin American Spanish, and that's only delving into the differences between hemispheres or sides of the planet. But I knew more or less how to speak Castellano, like proper Spanish. Not so much, not so much Latin American Spanish. I had teachers from that area of the world, and so I knew the nuances. I knew how to address people, like usted, formally say hi and all. But it was a little interesting to see the regional differences. Instead of saying the Spanish, the Castilian Spanish word hablar or charlar, I heard platicar, which I didn't know and actually had to look up when I first began speaking with community members. And so it was a huge learning curve. And I think the most important piece of getting through the project was community partnerships, as Bill mentioned. We spent about a month connecting with local organizations that worked with the Spanish-speaking population and knew intimately the struggles that they were facing, especially during the pandemic. One of those, as Bill mentioned, was the Hispanic Liaison, or El Vínculo Hispano in Spanish. They'd been in Siler City since 1995 and basically are the local Hispanic advocacy nonprofit. They help with everything: immigration, advocacy, eviction even. And they're the organization that Spanish speakers go to when they need help. We also worked with communities and schools of Chatham County, which does a lot of work within the school system with Spanish-speaking parents and their children. And so throughout that month, maybe a little bit beyond that month, we would meet with these organizations and we would just try to get to know what issues the population was facing. And out of that, we came up with a list of story ideas, a huge list of story ideas. And we spent probably the next few months going through those and looking at those. And as Bill mentioned, we did start out primarily with COVID coverage. We started out with how the pandemic and remote education affected Spanish-speaking families, many of whom would be working and couldn't necessarily watch their kids. They would have to go into work. A lot of them couldn't do remote work like many others. Technology literacy was another problem too. Many didn't know how to use computers, and when they went to learn, a lot of the instructions were in English, so the language barrier there didn't help as well. So we did a couple of stories on that, specifically with Spanish-speaking families, even students. Earlier in the year, we actually found a couple of students, Hispanic students, that had turned remote learning into an opportunity. One to take courses from Harvard and another to learn more English because she was an ESL student recently arrived from Mexico, to paint, to do all sorts of activities that she never would have if she'd been attending school. And I want to go back to the beginning. The one thing we did find out from our community partners was how the Spanish-speaking population consumed news. Particularly among the older Spanish-speaking population, we found that Facebook was very popular. With the younger generation, they're usually bilingual, English and Spanish, and therefore would be using Instagram and Twitter more so than Facebook. And since they're usually bilingual, we just incorporate our English coverage in those channels. But we chose Facebook to launch our bilingual page. And every week after I publish a story in English and then translate it into Spanish, we'll post both, first in English and then in Spanish, so that the Spanish appears at the top of the page. And we went back and forth originally with the name of the project, La Voz de Chatham. It means the voice of Chatham. We actually chose it with community partners' input. And so that's really proven to be an asset. We also learned, though, that the Spanish-speaking population in Chatham, a lot of people have immigrated or left their countries without a lot of formal education. Some were not formally educated in Spanish. Some couldn't read in Spanish. Some couldn't write. And so we learned from our partners that we would have to write more simply, make sure that all of our translations were not utterly complicated. But then again, that's good journalism, to make sure that it's utterly not complicated, so simple enough. But we also learned that we needed to have a video component, because a lot of people would prefer or have preferred to watch videos. It's simpler, it's easier. And to do that, we hired our part-time reporter and translator, Patsy Montesinos. She's a native Spanish speaker. She's no longer with us, but her family came from Mexico, and so she began creating a series of videos for us. The first one was this, as you see on the screen right now, a video in Spanish describing the project. And then she also created a series of human interest videos for us as well. One about a Siler City immigrant who walked 5 days and 5 nights over the border to Siler City to go see his dad, who he hadn't seen in 4 years. Learned English in school, formed part of a local high school's first soccer team, and within 3 years led that team to a championship. And then 10 years later, he'd created his own steel erection company from the ground up. We thought that was a really inspiring story and one that needed to be told. And so she did that through video, and I created an article to go along with it. She also created another video about a Siler City immigrant family, specifically a father and son. Father and the parents had originally immigrated from Mexico to California and then to Siler City. And he had dreams, the father that is. He wanted to go into law, he wanted to fight for people, but instead he chose to ensure his son had a better life. In fact, his sacrifices and those of his wife ensured that all three of their children made it through college. And so that's what the video is focusing on, how those sacrifices led to the next generation's success. We also included a written article for that as well. And as for other stories, we did, as Bill mentioned, we covered how COVID had affected businesses. One of them, that was actually the first story that we published. It's not on this slide, but you can check it out on the website. We looked into voting barriers for many Spanish-speaking voters as the election season approached. And we found that for some, it wasn't just the language barrier. A lot of the ballots can be translated into Spanish, and can be translated into Spanish if a local organization asked for them in time. But some voters couldn't read or write, as I mentioned, in English or Spanish, and so they needed additional help. But the most acute problem we found was that while there's a lot of Spanish language information available about national candidates, state candidates, there was hardly any at all about local candidates. And so we stepped up to address that as well, publicizing the barriers that some faced, as well as translating our own election coverage into Spanish so that that would be a resource for those who could use it. And there were a couple of Hispanic-owned businesses that opened in both Siler City and another town, Pittsboro. And so we covered their struggles, their successes as they opened. For one, it was just a lack of reach. They weren't able to tell people that they were there. And the pandemic discouraged foot traffic. So they originally struggled to stay afloat. And for another, he was well established within the town. He'd actually been in a different location before moving to another location in downtown Siler City. But for him, it was trying to secure all of the necessary inspections he needed to open. His business is a bakery, and he needed fire inspections, he needed sanitation inspections. But in the height of the pandemic, when he was trying to call the county to secure those, no one would answer him. Or rather, the person who was calling on his behalf, because he didn't speak English. And so for him, he found his struggles compounded, lack of revenue. He nearly thought about closing, and it took, I think, 5 months for him to be able to finally open in fall of 2020. Other businesses, restaurants primarily closed. Some have still struggled. Many have stayed afloat. And we also, beyond businesses, faith reporting, we also went into a couple of profiles, and even, as you can see on the screen, a sort of obituary. In December last year, a beloved member of the community was shot by his brother-in-law, and he died on the scene. And so we decided to make a tribute. We talked to his family members, his friends, community members who've known him, and constructed a memorial, as it were, a written memorial to follow his life. And that was really impactful among his friends and family. We also would translate the stories that other reporters wrote if we thought them relevant. For instance, a road closure or increasing COVID cases, vaccination information, basically the whole gamut. But I think one of the most important pieces of this was ensuring that we amplified community members' voices directly, that it wasn't just me writing about other people's stories. We actually managed to publish opinion pieces from community members at the very beginning. One of our first contributed pieces was from a young Guatemalan immigrant telling her story. I think it was titled, "I Don't Give Up." She came from Guatemala to join her family in Salar City. She learned English and she got through, found a job with an education company, I believe. And after that, we found other people who were willing to share their stories as well, whether it be about politics, whether it be about the Hispanic liaison. The piece in the middle is it's one from the executive director and founder of the Hispanic liaison. And our part-timer also wrote a few columns for us. First one about how the deportation of her father changed her life. Another one about her own experiences with ICE. And then we had a review of a Netflix series, Selena. This all culminated in launching a couple of Spanish language print editions, which was exciting. We first came up with the idea in December of 2020. It'd been in our minds for a long time, but December was really when we first dedicated ourselves to making sure it happened. It took a long time though, because we had to find advertisers, people willing to put ads in the paper. We went around Salar City and Pittsburgh trying to see whether Hispanic-owned businesses would like to place ads. We were somewhat successful in the beginning. 2 Hispanic-owned businesses did place ads, but by and large, we were unable to secure any of those. But we did have quite a few organizations express interest in placing ads, and we had to do all the translation work ourselves, save for a few like Manor Farms or the local health department. Bill, do you want to talk about the market?
Sure. Yeah, and when we did the funding, part of the grant funding, part of my budget for the grant request was to do at the end of the project a print edition. I neglected to say that earlier. So when we did publish this first print edition, which was broadsheet, it was not a tab. The first edition was broadsheet. As Victoria said, there were, we could show them our English language paper, but there was a lot of skepticism and hesitancy among the Hispanic-owned businesses. I can tell you that in our second print edition, the feedback and the response to the first print edition was so overwhelmingly positive. We printed about 4,000 copies, about 3,000 copies. We direct mailed 2,500 copies to Spanish-speaking households in Chatham County. And we had an overrun of about 500 that we provided to the Hispanic liaison, and then the schools wanted some. We ran out very, very quickly. We ran out of copies. So we've decided to make it quarterly. So the first edition was in the April-May time period. Our September issue, we switched it to a tabloid, and our advertising revenue doubled. We went from about $3,400 of revenue in the first 20-page broadsheet to about $6,800 in our second edition, which was a 40, refresh my memory, Victoria, how many pages broadsheet, how many tabloid pages? I think it was 40 pages tabloid.
40.
And again, double the revenue, advertisers much more willing to get involved. We actually, when you go from broadsheet to tabloid, your page size is half. We actually just kept our rates the same, full page, broadsheet, full page tab, same price, because we upped the total distribution to 5,000. So again, we mailed 2,500, and then we have distribution points through our partnerships. And the slide there In the middle is the cover of the tabloid edition. On the left-hand side is the cover of the first broadsheet edition. But yeah, we've got a lot of buy-in from advertisers for the second one, and they're clamoring for the next one, which we will publish right around the end of November.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to mention the marketing company?
Yeah, we worked with PERQ, P-E-R-Q. Many of you may be familiar with PERQ. We work with them on some printing and some other projects, but they can actually deliver mailing lists to your market based on whatever demographics criteria you want. And that's how we got the 2,500. We just asked them, we said, we want every Spanish-speaking household in Chatham County, and that through their analytics and metrics, they were able to deliver us 2,500 addresses. So I will tell you, we had one little surprise on the postage, the mailing, because we weren't able to use our normal postage permit. The mailing costs were a little bit higher. So if you want to do something like that, you need to look into that. But yeah, with the advertising revenue having doubled with the tabloid edition, and again the demand for it, we see this continuing on a quarterly basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had a lot of good feedback about these editions. Here are a couple of pages from the inside. The one on the left is a double truck that we decided to do about the pandemic's impact. Top article is about the pandemic's impact on Hispanic churches. The education article is on the right. Bottom is the business piece. And in the right corner, we had a story in December about a church that decided to bring the Virgen de Guadalupe, a Catholic saint, to the community instead of inviting the community inside the church and potentially spreading COVID-19. So we had a little stand in the paper about that because unfortunately we couldn't fit it in. And in our second print edition, we also decided to get a bit creative and add a sports section for the first time. Generally, we will translate sports stories, mostly soccer or anything we deem relevant. And we actually had a lot by the time we were putting together the print edition. And so the one on the left is about a martial arts studio that had to use virtual classes and pre-recorded videos to stay afloat during the pandemic. One on the right is about the soccer team, Los Jets, which is a very inspirational story for the county, especially Solid City. Back in the early 2000s, an investigative journalist named Paul Cuadros came down to Solid City and helps put together a local high school's first men's soccer program. I think I mentioned this earlier. The first team was predominantly Latino, and most of them were first generation immigrants themselves. Within 3 years, they'd already claimed a state championship. And that program has continued, and with a lot of success, as I understand it. I think they're 12-0 right now. This is another page at the beginning of the second print edition about a local Solid City nonprofit that helps immigrants achieve citizenship. Thought that would be very meaningful, and so we ensured that it was a 2-page spread. Another story about Chatham County's first Latino commissioner. And as we mentioned, this project has been really meaningful for a lot of people in the community. We have received so much good feedback and a lot of thank yous. Some people or some businesses, in particular, a bakery has told us that they began to receive more people at their business because of the articles. Others have reached out, reading our reports about, for instance, the Hispanic churches' struggle in the pandemic. They've reached out to us about how can we help? Can you connect me with these pastors? I want to help. Others have told us, have just expressed a little bit of surprise that we would take their opinions into account, which is a little sad when you think about it. But we've been really, really pleased with the response. Others have said that they now feel part of the county, whereas they didn't before, because now they can see themselves in the newspaper. And I probably say this every time I present on levels, but as journalists or historians of the present, we want to make sure that when people look at this community in this paper in 50 years, 100 years, that they see the entire community, not just what a few writers decided to write or deemed appropriate to write. Any questions?
Hi, I'm Andy. I am from the Standard Speaker in Hazleton, which has had tremendous growth in the Latino population in the last 10, 15 years, to the point where the school now has become one of the largest school districts in Pennsylvania, like top 5, and some 55% of the population is Latino. So 4 years ago, before I was here, actually, we began a product called Hazleton Oi, and quarterly, kind of like you guys did, we have both English and Spanish translations in that, and so and the advertisements are as well. It's been pretty successful. It's been getting more successful. Most of the content to this point has been generic, so to speak, press releases from state agencies and that kind of thing. We've started to do a little bit more with some news stories that we've had, that we do translate for the latest. But as you probably face, as a quarterly product, you're limited somewhat in what you can use because things just get old. But I want to ask you just a couple questions. Was there any other Spanish product or any other Spanish language media in Chatham County when you started this? Your radio or your monthly product, anything like that?
In a way, I would say there are plenty of statewide Spanish language publications, Que Pasa, Enlace Latino, but they're not local. There are also radio stations, some in Charlotte, Raleigh, La Noticia, La Conexión. But local news, no, we were the first Spanish language community paper in the county.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Can't read my own writing here. Oh, what kind of readership do you have now on the website?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have. I feel like most of our traffic comes from our English language stories. It ranges from as low as 50 readers to 1,000. We had a lot of people read the written memorial I mentioned earlier about the shooting victim. And we find that most of our traffic in Spanish stays, unfortunately, on our Facebook page. We see a few clicks here and there, but we see a lot more interaction with our videos and our photos. And so we're still working on building up our audience.
Sure, it'll take a while. I'm glad to hear some of the things you said, because this very weekend, and as of just a couple days ago, we now have Hazleton as a subsection of our main website. There's not really much content there right now, except the PDFs of recent editions and so forth. But we're publishing a story this weekend about a local man moved here from New York City, originally from Mexico, started a food truck business. He's doing very well. It's kind of along the lines of what you talked about, a good success story. We're doing it in conjunction with a commentary we have about Hispanic Heritage Month, and we have Spanish language versions of all this content ready to post online only, not in print. I just wondered, did you make a conscious decision not to use the? Our thought is we don't want to put at this point we're not rolling with a regular product or regular Spanish content, so we didn't want to like throw out this one Spanish story into our regular print product and suggest that come back in 3 months, maybe we'll have another one. So we're going to leave it out of print, but I just wondered if you had that any similar circumstances with deciding how far you go with your daily product in terms of Spanish content.
Mm-hmm. That was something that we decided not to do, mix English and Spanish. We were originally talking about including a Spanish language tab inside of the larger broadsheet English edition, but we decided that was probably not worth it, considering who's likely to pick up an English language
Right.
paper.
Okay. That's thinking too here. So, and is the product still quarterly now, or not beyond that? The print product, of course.
Yeah, the second one, we just decided to make it quarterly, and so we're working on our next one for November or December, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, part of the reason for quarterly is that we actually partner with another newspaper for our design, and so you're throwing another product in there, and none of the designers' readers speak Spanish. So we've got to compile stories. We've got to develop a budget for that publication, a news budget, and then we've got to get the pages produced and designed and proofed. And that takes the first time for the first publication, it took about 2 or 3 weeks because the designer just had 1 day a week to work on that product. And it took her 2 weeks to finish doing the pages. And then we had a week of proofing. The second time we were a little bit more streamlined, but that's a big challenge because again, we rely on it. The Wilson Times in Wilson, North Carolina, Restoration Media, they do our page design, and we just, it's not like we're a weekly newspaper. It's not like that we can have our own designers because we don't have designers. So we're at a little bit at the mercy of somebody else in that regard.
Okay. We're fortunate there. I mean, we produce it in-house with help from outside translators. So, okay. Well, really appreciate your answering my questions and taking the time to do this. It was extremely helpful.
You had mentioned that you had a lot of questions from your traditional readers, and can you go into any detail as to how you handled that? And hopefully you didn't lose anybody over that, or how did that work out?
We've had some pretty pointed subscription cancellations, but I think it has more to do with some of our other coverage. Like, for example, we did a series of stories on the lynching legacy of our county. Chatham County had the second highest number of lynchings in all of North Carolina. And we had our largest single copy distributor, a gentleman who owns 3 convenience stores in Chatham County, kick us out after the story. Actually, he kicked us out before the stories. One of our sports editor at the time, who was pretty like-minded with this guy, the sports editor is no longer with us, told the guy, "Can you believe what they're doing? They're right. He works for us. Can you believe what they're doing? They're writing a story about lynching." And the guy called me up, and he actually called the office and says, "I don't want your paper anymore." So they were selling about 150, 200 copies a week of the paper, and we've had there have been a few people who have walked into the office to cancel after specific stories, but we've added subscribers too. We don't paint ourselves as woke or liberal. It's not that at all. It's what's the news, what's relevant and compelling in the county, and we have to have balance in that reporting. So we've covered things that have happened. We do a lot of enterprise reporting. I get real frustrated with my hometown newspaper, which I used to publish, is all press releases and after the fact stuff. We do a lot of enterprise work, but part of that is reflecting what's happened in the community. Our community is very, and I could do a whole presentation on the divisiveness of our community. We're very red on one part of the county, very blue on the other, and there's actually an interstate that divides the two. Not an interstate, but it's US 64, and very divided politically in our county. We had a Confederate monument removed a little over a year ago, which has been a real flashpoint. We have neo-Confederate protesters coming into our market just about every weekend to protest that, even still with their Confederate flags. And there are fights and arrests, and it's just a really interesting market because it is so divided and so divisive. So we've gained readers and we've lost readers because we've covered what's going on.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, we're dealing with a lot of the same, very similar, minus the Confederate statues.
Yeah. I had an interview with our county manager this morning because I'm writing an update story. Our monument has been removed and it's in storage, and there's some lawsuits going on. But we were both just saying a lot of the folks who were doing the protest were not from our county, but because there was a monument being removed, it attracted a lot of attention. And you all know what we've been through politically the last few years and the attacks on the media, and it just makes it harder for us to do our jobs, particularly when people are consuming so much of their news from Facebook and from social media. It hurts credible outlets like what we're trying to be.
Victoria, is this all that you do, or do you, and I'm curious how much time you spend translating things. Can you actually write them in Spanish, or do you write them in English and then use some sort of app, or do you just write them in Spanish? And how much time does that take?
Right. I typically write them in English first, just because we have to make our Tuesday production deadline. And then after that, I will admit to using Google Translate as a shortcut, and then going through and fixing all of the errors I find. It's actually more time consuming than I would have thought. We typically translate between 2, even 10 in some weeks, stories, including the level stories. And so it takes at least a day. But I have another part-time reporter and translator that we hired to look over them, another set of eyeballs, and sometimes that can take up to 3 days depending on her schedule. Not ideal that, but it's a lot of work.
Are you doing the videos now? You had said that the person who did the videos before had left, or is your other part-time person doing the videos?
Unfortunately, we have no one doing that now. We couldn't find anyone to replace Patsy, and that's really an area of growth, I think. If we could find someone to assist with and fill in that gap, I think that'd be best.
Yeah, it's worth noting. Patsy graduated from Carolina and got a full-time job. It's not like, that's why she left. She's in the Washington, D.C. area. And the person we replaced her with is actually an editor at the Daily Tar Heel at UNC. So very, very strong journalist. She's more of a print journalist than Patsy was. So brings her own strengths to what we're doing.
Well, we are past 1 o'clock, but if anyone else has any questions, you've got these great resources right in front of you. So feel free to ask. We'll give you a few more seconds to ask. I'm sure they would be happy to take any questions via email afterwards as well. We can share their contact information. Well, it's right on the screen there, so that will be in your recording, that you can reach out to them later if you have specific questions about something that you're producing or want to produce. Great information. Thank you so much for giving of your time. I hope we'll see more of these types of projects around the country and in Pennsylvania too, because they're very valuable. to get the news and the information to the folks that need it, that live in your community. So great job.
Yeah, thanks again. We appreciate it. Good luck.
Thank
Thank you. So we'll send out the recording and evaluation, and hope that we have the opportunity to work with Bill and Victoria again.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
Melinda, for doing this.
No, thank you, Andy. I'm glad you were able to join and got some valuable information from it. So
Yeah, you're welcome. Absolutely. Thanks.
thank you again, Bill and Victoria, and I hope you have a good weekend and everyone takes care.
Thanks so much.
You guys.
Thanks for the opportunity.